Delivering this year's annual Lowitja O'Donoghue Oration at the University of Adelaide was Professor Patrick Dodson, a man uniquely positioned to speak on Indigenous affairs. As the inaugural chair of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, Professor Dodson's experience exemplifies a life dedicated to advocating constructive relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Speaking as part of National Reconciliation Week 2014, Professor Dodson's address is both timely and ever relevant, and APAC takes you to that now and in full.
This is APAC, Channel 648, Australia's public affairs channel.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very exciting evening. Thank you, Uncle Lewis, for your charming welcome. I never tire of them. Tonight is very special. I remember being around a dinner table last year talking about who the orator for this year will be. So Patrick asked me kindly to make his introduction very brief, and I'm going to totally ignore that. He said, just say thanks for the fact that I've come to the cold from Broome, and then asked me to come up on stage. And yeah, I can understand why he's finding the weather challenging after being in Broome with him recently. Patrick Dodson is a Yawuru man from Broome in Western Australia. He has dedicated his life to work to being an advocate for constructive relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, based on mutual respect, understanding and dialogue. He is a recipient of the Sydney International Peace Prize. He was a Royal Commissioner into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, inaugural Chair of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation and Co-Chair of the Expert Panel for Constitutional Recognition of Indigenous Australians. Patrick lives in Broome with his family, where he is involved in social, cultural, economic and environmental sustainability through his roles as Chair of the Lingiari Foundation, Executive Chair of the Nyamba Buru Yawuru, and he is the Adjunct Professor at the University of Notre in Australia in Broome, where he lectures in spirituality and the challenge of reconciliation. I feel really honoured to be introducing Patrick tonight because he is someone who's been extremely generous to me over many years. He took me under his wing many years ago, so if you don't quite like what I'm doing now, you can have a chat to him about that. And it's a particular honour because a man that I love and cherish dearly and whose leadership I think has been part of the reason that Australia has progressed as far as it has on the long journey so far. He's a very, very special and very humble man. And the fact that I have the privilege of having a very personal relationship with him where he still guides me and helps me to find my way through with my contribution, the fact that he is doing this in honour of another person who's very dear to me, Lowitja O'Donoghue, is an enormous privilege. She has also taken me under her wing over many years and is incredibly generous, even when sometimes she wants me to feel otherwise. Lowitja is another person whose legacy we're all amazingly aware of, and I think it's wonderful that in a time where we're talking about the importance of recognising the first Australians, that we should recognise the amazing contribution of Lowitja and Patrick. So let's give them an early applause, shall we? I first met Patrick back in 1997 at the Reconciliation Convention, and I was very much moved by his closing speech, where he said that for Australia to move forward, we all need to do something. We all need to take action. If we care about the relationship between the first Australians and everybody else, we need to do something about it. I took his advice literally, and I would suggest to you that you do the same. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Tanya, for those kind words, and particularly thanks to Lewis for your warm welcome. And I certainly will try and take your advice. We're trying to live longer, despite the odds. The list of people who were read out, I will acknowledge again. I'm privileged to do so, I must say. One of the few times I find that an honour. But let's start with a few words from my language, Yawuru, and say Ngaji Gurjan, just to say welcome and glad to be here. And we are meeting tonight on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I begin in the ancient and enduring custom of this land by acknowledging the traditional owners and by paying my respects to your elders and ancestors. I offer my thanks for a warm and generous welcome to your country, and I acknowledge your lasting custodianship of it. I am honoured by the invitation to deliver this year's Lowitja O'Donoghue's Oration, and I thank Lowitja herself, the Don Dunstan Foundation, the University of Adelaide, and I also thank each of you who have made time to come to this event or to tune into the broadcast. I acknowledge certainly Uncle Lewis O'Brien, Dr. Lowitja O'Donoghue, His Excellency Rear Admiral Kevin Saas and Mrs Saas, Senator Nigel Scullion, Ian Hunter, the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and Reconciliation, the former Premier of the State, Mr Lynn Arnold, Dr Lynn Arnold, Greg Crafter and Anne Levy, Professor Michael Barber, the Vice-Chancellor of Flinders University, Professor Dennis Kirkpatrick, representing the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Adelaide, Professor Darryl Rigney, Dean of Indigenous Strategies and Engagements at Flinders University, Professor Peter Buckskin and Robin Layton, the Co-Chairs of Reconciliation South Australia, the Very Reverend Frank Nelson, Dean of St Peter's Cathedral, Professor Lester Irabana Rigney, representing the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice-President Academic at the University of Adelaide, and Associate Professor Veronica Arbon, Director of the Wirral Yawuru Aboriginal Education Unit at the University of Adelaide. As I began to prepare some thoughts of what I might say to you tonight, the seasons up north were turning, yellow flowers were blooming, and the long grass was beginning to dry and die off, signalling to us that the salmon were running and the rest and set the task and obligations for our people in managing country ticked over into the next part of the cycle, the season of Buru. Such management is guided by a deep knowledge of the land that has sustained civilisation in the harshest continent on the earth over time, by sophisticated and clever design rather than any imagined fluke or coincidence. And yet, regrettably, many Australians remain less than familiar with stories like this of our nation's origin and of the remarkable achievements of the first Australians. I suggest that one of the underlying reasons this unfamiliarity persists is in part because modern Australia's founding document, the Constitution of Australia, continues to remain silent about the history of occupation. So tonight I want to talk to you about the constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the once-in-a-generation opportunity that we have to address this silence. I want to talk a little bit about the recommendations of the expert panel and urge our political leaders and the committee charged with deliberating further on the model of recognition and assessing public readiness to be bold and to have courage and confidence in the Australian people. I ask that they do not give us cause to walk away from this moment of promise. I also want to put the struggle for rights and recognition into some perspective and acknowledge the dedication, leadership and resilience of my fellow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, whose determination has brought us this opportunity at long last. I want to speak briefly to the handful of doubters who seek to bring fear where there is need for none. And I want to recognise the growing momentum and movement of mainstream Australians who understand the rareness of the opportunity before us and who are working together for this chance to make Australia a better place for all of us. One that will improve our international standing and respect if we get it right, and no doubt our derision if we don't. In many respects, Lowitja O'Donoghue's life reveals and reflects a little of our nation's evolution. Taken from her Yankunytjatjara mother as a 2-year-old, she was raised in the Colebrook Children's Home. There was time spent as a domestic servant for a family with 6 children, before blazing a trail into the world of nursing to become one of the first Aboriginal nurses in South Australia. She helped to push open many doors that had been shut to Aboriginal people through activism in the Aboriginal Advancement League and as part of the movement of black and white campaigners who gave us the resounding 67 referendum victory. A long and distinguished career in public service would follow, accumulating enormous public regard and respect and recognition. She would lead landmark negotiations on native title and chair ATSIC and become an Australian of the Year, a National Living Treasure and an Order of Australia, amongst her many honours. In time too would come a reunion with the mother who had yearned for her through all those lost years and whose language, country and culture Lowitja was denied in that long and painful separation. Hers is a story that should remind younger generations of Australians about the injustices and exclusions of law and policy and the prejudice that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples have endured in our own land. It should also spur them to question the unjust foundations for such laws and policies so that they might work to make Australia a better place. Equally, it should remind us of the determination, courage and perseverance of the many who work to create a better future, a more just future for our people and our nation. And it gives us a glimpse of how we have worked methodically and constructively to help the country take each next step forward. Discipline, stamina and resilience are required to achieve outcomes of great moment. In this, history can be our guide. Each of those watershed moments in the last century, the Day of Mourning in 1938, the Yirrkala Bark Petition in 1963, the Gurindji Walk-Off in 1966, the referendum victory in 1967, the Northern Territory Land Rights Act in 1976, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the Bringing Them Home report on the stolen generations, Mabo and Wick, and in 2008 the apology. Each of them came after sustained and resolute effort by our own leaders and by non-Indigenous leaders who stood with us. None of these events by themselves resolved every issue that confronts our people, but each of them take us a step forward so we can then contemplate another. Don Dunstan's personal story reflects another part of this jigsaw of progress. For in his powerful legacy as a social reformer, whether it was campaigning for the justice for my friend Max Stewart, advocating alongside Aboriginal people for land rights in South Australia, or in supporting the advocacy of the 1967 referendum campaigners, he remains fondly remembered by many. Personal courage and leadership are always associated with his legacy. It is also heartening to watch the passion and commitment of the next generation of young campaigners for this recognition referendum. Young leaders like Tanya Hosh and Jason Glanville, Shannon Dodson, along with Charlie Sue Frail and Pete Dawson, and all their many contemporaries who are helping to build the movement of recognition. On the walls of the Yawuru office hangs a series of art panels from an exhibition called Opening the Common Gate, Challenging the Boundaries in Broome. The term Common Gate referred to a fence line on the outskirts of Broome that was used to keep cattle out of the town. But following the passing of the 1905 Aborigines Act, was used as a physical boundary to keep natives in law out of the town. This exhibition was developed to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the 67 referendum and tells personal stories of local people's experience with laws and policies that sought to segregate, marginalise and exclude them. This segregation is explicit in a 1928 map of the town of Broome, which is recorded in one of these panels. And this map shows the demarcated zones where people of different nationalities could live. Blue for whites, green for Aborigines and half-castes, red for half-castes and Asiatics and full-bloods, and yellow for Asiatics only. Underpinning this formal discrimination in Broome was the White Australia policy and the Aboriginal Protection Policy, both of which were informed by racial thinking at the time. This happened not just because it was policy of that era, but also because notions of race that informed the drafting of our Constitution gave confidence to all those who pursued such policies. As Australians, we still live with the original dispossession of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the devastating impact of colonisation on Indigenous peoples of this continent. We live with a history that has involved systematic efforts to wipe out a rich culture and languages that existed before any permanent European settlement or presence. The devastating death tolls of the frontier wars and the forced exiles of Indigenous peoples from their spiritual and ancestral homelands. The displacement and destabilisation of families and the efforts to wipe out traces of our very being were part of the settler history of this country. People of my parents' generation lived with formal discrimination and servitude. They were treated as second-class citizens on their own lands and had their lives subjected to instructive and intrusive administrative surveillance and control. The disadvantage and dependency that some of our people experienced, the chronic poverty, poor health, the substance abuse, family violence and high incarceration rates cannot be divorced from this history. Our disadvantage is not ahistorical. It has a history of structural violence, which we must deal with in order to be liberated from the past. This has always been part of the challenge of reconciliation. Truth, mercy, justice, forgiveness. Each goes to the hard work of building peace and reconciliation. Each requires a personal choice, a decision, to acknowledge and repair the wrong, to rebuild trust, to let go of the grievance, and to reset the relationship. I speak of these heartbreaking parts of our national story, not to dwell on the past or become stuck in it, but so we might go forward with an understanding of why race and discrimination should no longer be part of our legal framework, and why meaningful recognition of Indigenous peoples is a cause worth fighting for. I was part of the expert panel established by the Gillard government in 2011. The expert panel comprised of 22 Australians from very diverse backgrounds and political persuasions, and was co-chaired by Mark Liebler and myself. And I want now to outline some of our recommendations. The expert panel's task was to consult on possible options for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia to be recognised in the Australian Constitution. We had 1 year to report back. During that time, we consulted as widely as we could, received numerous submissions and sought extensive advice from Indigenous leaders and constitutional law experts. We also gathered data through research, surveys and polling. When formulating our recommendations, the panel was guided by 4 principles, and these principles were that each proposition must be technically and legally sound and be capable of being supported by an overwhelming majority of Australians from across the political and social spectrums. In addition, they had to be of benefit and in accord with the wishes of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and contribute to a more reconciled nation. The expert panels recommended 5 specific changes to the Constitution, and I'd briefly like to outline them and talk about some of the options we recommended. And I urge those of you who have not done already to read our report. It is on the recognised website and there is a plain English version. The panel proposed changes that entail the removal of 2 sections and the insertion of 3 sections to the body of the Constitution. Firstly, we recommended the removal altogether of Section 25 of the Constitution, and this is a section that still enables the states to disenfranchise people on the basis of race. Secondly, the panel recommended the removal of Section 51(26), otherwise known as the race power. Thirdly, the panel recommended that a new power, Section 51A, be inserted to replace Section 51(26). This new section, 51A, would contain a preambular statement and give the Commonwealth Parliament the power to pass laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Fourth, the panel recommended the insertion of a non-discrimination provision, Section 116A. Such a provision would prohibit the Commonwealth, states and territories from discriminating on the basis of race, colour, ethnic or national origin. but would still allow for laws to address the effects of past discrimination, to remove disadvantage amongst groups of people, and to protect the culture or heritage of any group. The fifth recommendation was the insertion of a new section 127A that affirms English as the national language of Australia and recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages as part of our national heritage. The Commonwealth Parliament passed the Act of Recognition in 2013 to ensure that this matter is progressed by Parliament within 2 years. The recommendation of our panel are now being considered by a committee of the Commonwealth Parliament, chaired by the Honourable Ken White, with Senator Nova Peris as Deputy Chair. This committee is tasked with the responsibility of finalising the question or proposition to be put to the Parliament in the form of a bill and then to the Australian voters by way of a referendum. The call for constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is not new. Throughout the last century, many Indigenous groups and leaders have noted the glaring omission in the foundation document of our nation state. Most notable were the 67 campaigners for the referendum, who helped bring about one of the most successful referendums in our country's history. And this was no mean feat, as a double majority is required. That is, a majority of the majority of yes votes by those eligible to vote and a majority of the states. A very high bar. Australia does not have a very good record of voting yes in referendums, with only 8 out of 44 referendums delivering a successful outcome. The 1967 referendum was won with more than 90% yes vote, making it a great source of inspiration, a testimony to not only the perseverance and hard work of those who campaigned for decades to bring about this reform, but to all those Australians who voted overwhelmingly to end the constitutional exclusion of Aboriginal people from the national polity. In this respect, I regard the 1967 referendum as a pivotal turning point in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Arguably, one of the first steps we have taken as a nation on the long road towards reconciliation. While the 1967 referendum addressed the provisions that expressly excluded us, it did not deal with the recognition of Indigenous peoples, nor did it eliminate the potential for laws in Australia to be racially discriminatory. Both Section 25 and Section 5126 in their current form allows for the making of laws by reference to the concept of race. And as I've said, Section 25 gives the states the ability to disenfranchise people on the basis of their race, even though there are consequences for the states in terms of their representation in the House of Representatives. If they were to do this, it still remains that the Australian Constitution permits states to discriminate against an entire race of people by excluding them from voting. And by any standards, this is simply unacceptable. When we turn to Section 5126, we are confronted with the same potential for discrimination. The intent of this power was clear from the outset. Sir Edmund Barton, the man who would go on to become Australia's first Prime Minister, said in 1898 it was regarded as necessary, and I quote, to regulate the affairs of the people of coloured and inferior races who are in the Commonwealth, close quote. It is no surprise then that the first act passed under the head of power was the Immigration Restriction Act, an act that laid the foundations of the White Australia policy. As it currently exists, Section 5126 allows the Commonwealth to make laws for people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary. Prior to 1967, Aboriginal people were expressly excluded from this power. In the main, this was because Aboriginal people were regarded as being the responsibility of the states rather than the Commonwealth. And following the 67 referendum, the words prohibiting the Commonwealth from passing laws for Aboriginal people under Section 5126 were removed. And this enabled the Commonwealth to use this head of power to pass national laws for Aboriginal people and therein to assume also a greater responsibility for Indigenous affairs. However, relying on the race power for lawmaking was not without concern. During the parliamentary debates, people like Sir Robert Menzies and Billy Snedden, both members of the Liberal Party, warned about the potential for unfavourable use of the race power in its current form if Aborigines were included. Billy McMahon, another Liberal Prime Minister, argued it should only ever be used in a favourable manner. But we know now, from the Hindmarsh Island Bridge case, there is no requirement for the law passed under this head of power to be for the benefit of a group of people. This means that the laws which have an adverse or discriminatory effect on a particular race of people can also be passed. It thus remains that at least in two important respects, our nation's constitution wants for something imperative and fundamental. Firstly, it makes no reference to Indigenous peoples' occupations of this land prior to British settlement. And it contains anachronistic race provisions that do not reflect our modern values or our obligations under international conventions to eliminate racial discrimination. To complete the work of those leaders of the 1967 referendum, we must ensure that the laws passed for our people cannot be for the adverse purpose. In order to do this, we must deal with the race provisions once and for all and eliminate race as a basis of lawmaking. Nor can we ignore the discriminatory potential of Section 5126 if we are to sever any future legal interpretations based on that abhorrent thinking about inferior or coloured races. We must consign the race power to the dustbin of history. That is why the expert panel proposed deletion of the race power altogether and recommended the insertion of a new head of power, Section 51A. This new section would provide recognition of our unique status as the First Peoples through the inclusion of a preambular statement and give the Commonwealth Parliament the power to make laws with respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The panel also found a new head of power, such as the proposed 51A, was necessary because repealing 5126 would have implications for the validity of legislation acted previously under that power, and this includes legislation like the Native Title Act. With regard to the preamble, the expert panel took the view that a preamble of no legal effect would not be in accord with the wishes of the majority of the Indigenous Australians and would likely be regarded as tokenistic and half-hearted. There are also a number of other issues to do with structure and content which indicated that the proposition of a standalone preamble would not be very straightforward. And that is why the expert panel recommended that the preambular statement of recognition to be incorporated into the new section 51A these following words. It recommended recognising that the continent and its islands now known as Australia were first occupied by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, acknowledging the continuing relationship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with their traditional lands and waters, respecting the continuing cultures, languages and heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and acknowledging the need to secure the advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Commonwealth shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws for the peace, order and good government of the Commonwealth with respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We also proposed that as a modern democracy, our Constitution should provide a guarantee against racial discrimination. To that end, we propose that a new section 116A on non-discrimination should also be adopted. Such a provision, as I've said, would prohibit the Commonwealth, the states and territories, governments from passing laws that discriminate against people on the basis of their race, ethnicity or nationality. Such a guarantee is a feature of other constitutions, including both Canada and South Africa. And there is a clear and compelling logic of how these propositions fit together as two halves of the whole: the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-racial discrimination against any citizen. You can't have recognition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and then maintain the ability of the Commonwealth to racially discriminate against us. The racial non-discrimination protection proposed in 116A affirms the principle that all citizens of this country should be protected from laws that discriminate on the basis of their race, ethnicity and nationality. In this regard, it is a protection for all, not just Indigenous peoples. The proposal for a racial non-discrimination provision is not a one-step Bill of Rights. At the end of the day, our Constitution is not like the American Constitution. It is primarily concerned with setting out the powers of the Commonwealth Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary. In this regard, it says more about institutions and their powers rather than the rights of citizens. Lowitja once remarked, "Our Constitution says little about what it means to be Australian. It says nothing but how we find ourselves here, save being an amalgam of former colonies of Britain. It says nothing of how we should behave towards each other as human beings and as Australians." I also want to take this opportunity to say a few words tonight in the broader context of reconciliation about the proposed changes to the Racial Discrimination Act, and to stand with the many Indigenous people, Jewish and ethnic communities who have voiced their powerful and passionate objections. Perhaps it is easy when you haven't experienced racial abuse almost daily over a lifetime to think that the only solution needed to racial hatred is a debating society. Yet for every Australian who knows the experience of seeing or reading another human being's racist venom directed towards you based on the colour of your skin or the ancestry you have, you know the damage it inflicts upon us, and more heartbreakingly, on our children and grandchildren. It can make us ill and sap our confidence. It drives us out of places and spaces where we have every right to live and learn and earn our lives like any other Australian. So it is not a triviality. We've seen recently the courage shown by Adam Goodes, an AFL footballer, in confronting such racism, and the ability of these moments that unify us all as Australians in eliminating behaviour that is clearly at odds with our national character. We need the ongoing signal that is sent by the law, which says that some modest recourse should be available to any of us when foul racist abuse or hatred is directed towards us. Under the current laws, it is important to note that people can still say and do things that are racially offensive, so long as they also meet the test of doing so reasonably and in good faith, in a fair and accurate report on a matter of public interest or a debate on public policy. Free speech is not the problem. Its expression in a responsible and respectful manner is what is important. Keeping such modest protections is part of the greater national project of reconciliation, of helping us to live alongside each other with respect and more cohesion, and with empathy and humanity, of appreciating our diversity of cultures and celebrating our common humanity, rather than discriminating against another on the obnoxious notion of race or out of some misplaced sense of superiority. The recommendations of the expert panel need to be weighed fairly and honestly. We need to be able to carry the proposition for recognition and non-discrimination in great numbers, but we also need those tasked with deciding the proposition that will be put to us as electors to deliver to us something worth campaigning for. If there is no attempt to deliver substantive reform that will be meaningful for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, we should not be prepared to go to referendum. I want to say to those men and women who are serving the nation in that task, and indeed to the Prime Minister and his Cabinet colleagues who will consider the draft proposal, that we should seek the best model and we should be courageous about it. Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples goes to the heart of what type of nation we want to be. Are we people that shrink from the uncomfortable truth of the past, or a nation that is mature and capable enough of addressing a wrong and making our Constitution something we and the next generation can take pride in? The rest of us can play our part in that outcome by letting our political leadership know that there is support for meaningful, unifying and responsible reform. We can reassure them that we are ready to begin the next chapter. We need to make it clear to the whole world and to future legislators that we value our country's unique Indigenous heritage and traditions. We need to recognise the first Australians and continue down the pathway that will enable us to genuinely reset the relationship. In order for this to be a powerful unifying moment, we also need to ensure that this is carried by the highest possible percentage of Australians with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander support. But all the groundwork needs to be completed before the final date can be set for the referendum. And this is where every one of us has to work hard and play our part to bring it off. So tonight I ask you to apply yourself to building the groundswell of popular support, to build it further and deeper and wider amongst the Australian people. This will not happen without our active involvement and the active involvement of many other Australians like yourselves. I urge you to join the Recognise movement at recognise.org.au and add your name to the more than 1,805 Australians who have already registered their support for this referendum. I ask you to talk about why it is important to you, and to do that wherever you go. Make clear your own aspirations, be informed and familiarise yourselves with the expert panel's report and its recommendations, as well as the parliamentary process that's in action now. Be on the record with your views to your representatives and institutions. It is important to have a constructive debate and to consider carefully what the proposition will mean for us as a nation. However, we should distinguish between those wanting to bring fear and division and those who may have legitimate insights into how a head of power could achieve meaningful and respectful recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It is important to remember that even in the lead-up to Federation, there were some who fretted and frowned and got themselves tied up in anticipatory knots about the move to bring the colonies together into one nation. There are claims it could suppress wages increases, claims it may lead to Melbourne becoming the national capital, wild assertions that trade would not be allowed to follow its natural channels, and that Federation would lower the value of all property. When the Mabo and Wick judgments were handed down, we heard some ludicrous statements as well, that recognising native title would lead to people losing their backyards, that native title would ruin the mining and pastoral industries, and Australia would be divided forever. There are attacks on our High Court for passing such rulings. But 20 years have now passed, and has the sky fallen in? In fact, some of the most vocal opponents of native title, the mining and pastoral industries, are now amongst the biggest supporters of reconciliation and have working relationships with Aboriginal peoples. We need to consider any unintended consequences that may arise in advance, and we need to be responsible and cautious, but we also need to be brave. Symbolism over substance will not suffice. We must demand that the way forward be meaningful and just, not out of a sense of guilt, but out of what we know to be right. This will be a moment of truth for us, and so we must insist the search for the highest truth to prevail in our seminal document. Tony Abbott, just 7 months before he became Prime Minister, had the measure of what this project meant for the country when he declared that without constitutional recognition of the fact that someone was here, Australia would remain an incomplete nation and a torn people. In recent debates, many other settler societies around the world have recognised Indigenous peoples and cultures and languages in their constitutions. Canada, the United States and New Zealand have long-standing treaty rights, and in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Russian Federation, Bolivia, Brazil, Cambodia, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, the Philippines and South Africa. These are constitutional mentions or powers about some aspect of their nation's Indigenous cultures, tongues or peoples. This doesn't mean that everything and every issue that confronts those societies and their Indigenous populations have been perfected. But it has meant that there has been a time in the lives of each of these nations when each acknowledged that someone was already living there at the time of settlement. We should be standing together, neither one in front nor behind, but alongside each other to rectify what has long been an omission, that the modern Australian nation state of Australia is established on the lands of the Indigenous peoples with a history of occupation that spans millennia. It is important to remember that before European arrival, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had both rights and obligations in our country. We had rights and obligations to manage and renew the land. We had trade rights. We had rights and obligations to practice ceremony and pass down the laws of the land from each generation to the next. Rights to induct and educate our generations to come of their obligations and responsibilities. In all ways, we were sovereign peoples of the ancestral lands and waters we occupied. There may be those amongst the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who prefer to maintain a separate sovereign position. I understand this perspective and respect their views. And on the matter of treaty, which is dear to the hearts and minds of many Indigenous peoples, the expert panel came to the view that this was a matter that required resolution and negotiation. It required that first, a task that was simply beyond the terms of reference of the panel. Constitutional recognition in this respect does not foreclose on sovereignty, treaty or agreement making. Opportunities to change the Constitution comes along rarely. It is a chance for the people of Australia to come together knowing their sovereignty is not being challenged, nor is that of the Indigenous peoples. Constitutional monarchy is not being overturned, and the rule of law is not being changed. The Constitution tomorrow will still set out our polity and institutional arrangements. On reconciliation, the vision I hold is not one of separate existence, but coexistence on principles of acknowledgement, respect, law and unity. As the Reconciliation view spoke of, a united Australia that respects this land of ours and values the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In the early days of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, we sought to find common ground between peoples who had felt none before. On one trip, the late great Rick Farley from the National Farmers Federation and I both travelled to the Kimberley to meet with the cattlemen and to try and help them bridge the divides. The white stockmen complained about Aboriginal people camping on properties and leaving gates open, the Aboriginal stockmen complaining and taking issue with being locked out of their own traditional lands and of being disrespected. It took a while before we could find the unity of common ground, but find it they did. As these men talked, they realised what it was that united them rather than what it was that divided them. It was a common pride and a stake in the iconic industry they all shared. And when they came together to talk about how they could work together in that way, it helped to take many of the other burrs out from under the saddle of their relationship. This is not to say that everything was perfect. We are a work in progress, after all, as human beings and as a nation. We come from diverse backgrounds and understandings, but we are all Australians. We have to aspire to bring out the best of each other on the basis of mutual respect and acceptance. Less than that, it becomes very undignified. And so I want to return to where I began, to the task of our finding common ground even more firmly as a nation. If the country can come together around our Aboriginal heritage and our ongoing place in the heart of the national identity, no longer forced to live constitutionally outside the common gate, we can then reasonably look to building a better society. It will be an honouring of those Australians who sought constitutional change for the better in the past, a service to ourselves and to each other as an act of unity and reconciliation, a service to future generations of Australians, an opportunity to repudiate terra nullius and cooperate and co-create a new narrative for the modern Australian nation state, and a moment of truth for all of us to celebrate with great pride. Kalia.